Welcome to another Operate First Data Science Community Meetup. I am Akanksha. I'm a data scientist in the AI Ops team. And today we have Surya, who's also a data scientist in the AI Ops team. He's going to talk about the anomaly detection using the hierarchical temporal memory algorithm on the Operate First CPU data. So over to you, Surya.
Thank you very much. Can everybody see my slide?
Yes.
All right. So thank you very much, Akanksha. Hi, everyone. This is Surya Prakash Pathak, a data scientist in AI Ops team and now Open Services team, working with manager Michael Clifford. And today I want to give you a brief intro about working principle of hierarchical temporal memory and its application to anomaly detection. Now, today's talk include a brief comparison of deep neural networks, with HTM, and which is then followed by the introductions about hierarchical temporal memory and its working mechanisms. I will then conclude my talk by giving you a brief intro about anomaly detections and showing a little bit demo about how I applied this HTM algorithm in detecting the anomaly in CPU uses data from operate first cluster. So artificial intelligence, whenever I talk about artificial intelligence, deep neural networks comes in picture. So deep neural networks have immense applications in different industrial fields, be it healthcare, be it technology like fraud detections and so on. So, but it does have a lot of limitations as well. Like it needs thousands, if not millions, samples to train on. It find very hard to adapt to continually changing data and surprises. And it is also susceptible to noise and easily can be fooled. The source that I linked over there is a paper depicting where a group of scientists pasted a sticker on the traffic signs, like stop signs, and they fooled a machine learning system in classifying the object. You can check that paper over there as well. So therefore, deep neural networks instead of artificial intelligence can be said as a framework for assistive intelligence more. So it does not work as our brain does and cannot lead to the true artificial intelligence. HTM, Hierarchical Temporal Memory, which is a theoretical framework for both biological and generalized machine learnings. It is based on the latest understanding of neocortex. Neocortex is a part of our human brain. It only requires few hundreds of samples to learn. One of the important characteristics is it learns unsupervised as it goes and easily handles changing data and surprises. It is immune to up to 40% of noise in the data. HTM, as the name suggests, it's hierarchical. It's composed of levels of stack cells which work on the algorithm. The temporal, it operates on time series data. And memory, it does not just relies on the present instant of the data, but relies also on the memory or the previous state of the data as well. And this really opens the way for truly intelligent systems. Now let's talk a bit about how it got into the present day it is in. So Jeff Hawkins, who originally invented Palm Pilot, which is something like a very primitive smartphone-like devices, Jeff Hawkins and Sandra Belsky wrote On Intelligence book on 2004, explaining about the mechanism of human brain, how it remembers different things, and what intelligence is, the core concept of hierarchical temporal memory in that book. In 2005, he formed a research lab which works on the reverse engineering of the neocortex. So he wanted to understand the working mechanism of neocortex so that he can apply it to the technology framework. In 2014, this project got open sourced with the GitHub handle NewPick. The API over here used is Python 2.7 and C++. In 2015, there's a community fork of newpick.core got developed. known as HTM.core with API of Python 3.7 plus and C++. In 2021, A Thousand Brains Theory of Jeff Hawkins, that is the new book that got published recently. And here you can find further explanations of more detailed mechanisms of how HTM algorithm works and how it is in direct correspondence to how our human brain works. So as Jeff Hawkins says, it is really directing to the true intelligence system. And HTM or Numenta is constantly evolving with Numenta open research. So Neocortex, we talked about HTM being conceptually similar to the neocortex. What is neocortex? Neocortex is the part that you are seeing in the picture. It's a part of the brain, covering the brain. It's the size of the large table napkin, which is like 50 by 50 square centimeters. That's it. Whatever I do, whatever I think, how I behave, completely depends on this neocortex. Whatever I'm speaking right now, whatever you are listening right now, it's all because of this neocortex. And it constitutes of 75% of the brain's volume, which is 2.5 millimeter thick. It contains almost 20 billion neurons, tens of thousands of synapses per neurons. Synapses are the intersections, just to be clear, intersections which acts as a memory or some spike in the neuron. One of the important characteristics is it is sparsely active. Now, we just said there are 20 billion neurons, but all 20 billion neurons does not take part at once in any activity. So only 2% of spiking of the neuron takes place at one particular time. And it's constantly predicting its input. And this is also a fascinating feature of our human brain, which I also came to know. Like, our brain is constantly predicting. If you are going somewhere, you're predicting that you'll reach there in that moment of time. If you are talking to somebody, you are predicting some input from others as well. So whatever you do, it's always a prediction. And if the prediction does not work perfectly, you learn something new. So that's how the memory gets added in your brain, and that's how you become more experienced. And it learns the model of the world. That's how it learns the model of the world, by predicting constantly new things. So more into the neocortex. How does the neocortex looks like? This is another fascinating feature. All areas in the neocortex looks the same, which means the neocortex that is connected to my eye and the neocortex that is connected to my ear, they are same, which actually means they perform the same basic function. Computationally speaking, they have the same basic algorithm. So let's say I'm speaking at the moment. You are hearing something, you are seeing me, your eye is transferring my image in your brain, ear is transferring my voice in your brain. Although the nerve that acts as an encoder from the eye to the brain and ear to the brain, that encoder encodes in the same format when it reaches the neocortex. That's pretty fascinating feature which we have in our brain. So the main thing is we have the same algorithm. Everything works in the same algorithm. So what makes one region visual and another touch depends upon what nerve they are connected to. Nerve, I can correlate it with what encoder machine that they are connected to. The basic unit of replications is the cortical column, which we can see in the picture. Each individual column, 1 millimeter square each, and we have about 2 million of them. So logically, a cortical column is the basic unit of computation. If you move deeper into the cortical column, we can see thousands of neurons over here. And we can also see different layers of neurons over here. This is the real image of cortical column, where we have different layers of neuron. So basically, a cortical column has different layers of neuron arranged in a different mini columns. And these neurons are connected both horizontally and vertically. So any way the transfer of information can take place. It is very complex thing. So whatever the column does must also be complex, and whatever the column does, so does the neocortex. That means each cortical column has a very complex characteristics, which means the neocortex has a complex algorithm. If we move on, coming back to the deep neural net neuron, the figure on the right hand side is based on 1957 concept of perceptron, where we have weights, we have inputs, and these weights, which are generally compared with the synapses, they are summed up in a neuron like format, and to get the output, we pass it through the activation function, which are generally non-linear. So that's how the process takes place, basic process takes place. It is then converted into this deep learning neurons composed of large hidden layers, which in turn has many applications. So the basic concept behind these deep neural networks are the arrangement of weights in the learning process. But our human brain does not behave like this. We don't have any weight feature inside our brain. And Jeff Hawkins, what he wanted to do is he does not want it to mimic this weight feature in the technology. Instead, he wanted to mimic the brain mechanism in the algorithm. Let's move forward. So what is the structure of the real neuron? The structure on the right hand side depicts the real neuron. It has dendrites, it has axon, and it has proximal dendrites at the center. Now, synapses have the intersections. There are 5K to 30K excitatory synapses in the dendrites. Now, out of these synapses, 10% can cause neural spike. So there is only out of 100%, only 10% which are in the proximity of the cell cause a neural spike. Now, for many years, people didn't know about what this 90% of distal synapses does. Are they just there for being there, or do they have any kind of significance? Well, it turns out that these dendrites which are called distal dendrites, are pattern detectors. They do not make a neural spike. Instead, they transform the neuron, transform the point into the predictive state. Now, what is the predictive state is, compared to the inactive neuron, which does not have any spike, and compared to the spiked neuron, which is definitely predicting that form, the intermediate state is the predictive state. The predictive state is the one if the similar input fires, if the similar input reaches the brain or the neocortex or the neuron, then the neuron in the predictive state fires faster. So if there is a higher chance of predicting something, means the distal dendrites in the vicinity of neurons are in the predictive state. If we move on, how HTM is compared with this brain working mechanism. Now, HTM don't attempt to model all aspect of biological neurons, but they only attempt to model some essential feature of the neocortex. So as we have over here, we have these layers of cells. These are basically the grid cells, which I'll come later on. So these grid cells behave like the neurons. These grid cells behave like the layers of neurons. So HTM neuron state depends on the position and number of activated synapses, not in the sum of weights. So depending upon whether the given cell in this grid is activated or not, it depends, the given information is recorded. Now, neural learning. Now, one interesting thing about the synapse is whenever there is a formation of synapses, it learns something new. It stores information. And if the brain does not want that information, then a synapse is disconnected. So that is in the biology sense. However, in the HTM algorithm sense, we call it a permanence, which is the synapse state. A zero permanence is the state where dendrite and axon are disconnected. Nothing, it is doing nothing. The neuron is doing nothing. However, the one state is the neuron is doing some work. It is in the active state. Maybe in 0.3, it is some very predictive state. So this learning occurs by incrementing or decrementing the synapse permanence. The synapse is disconnected for a permanence under the threshold. A synapse is connected for a permanence over a threshold. So there is some threshold value related with the disconnection and the connection of these synapses. If we move on, so if we come back to the layer of cortical column, and if we want to mimic these layers of cortical column with the sequence memory, what we see over here is, if we take a part of this, let's say these are the layers of neuron in a cortical column, and we take these layers as the layers of different grid, which we compare this with the neurons. So as we can see, the neurons in some cells, all the columns are active, that is given by the dark shade, and in some cells only one neuron or 2 or 3 neurons are active per column. This is called a sequence memory. Now, if I do the top projections of this framework, of this column framework, and put the darker line for at least one active neuron in the grid, then I'll form this type of representation. If I see this if I see this structure in a top view and form a shape like this, it will form a grid structure, which is called the sparse distributed representation. And it is one of the most important concepts in terms of hierarchical temporal memory. To understand more about it, what are SDRs, or sparse distributed representations? SDRs are how brain solve the problem of representing knowledge. It is used in the context of every aspect of cognitive functions. We were discussing before, like if I hear something, that information from my ear through some nerve goes to the brain. It is encoded into something, and that something is sparse distributed representation in terms of HTM. It is the representation that the algorithm can understand, whatever input signal it is, be it visuals, be it numeric, be it categorical, anything. It can be converted into a sparse distributed representation, and once it is converted into this SDRs, the algorithm can understand other thing. Now each bit has a semantic meaning, meaning if we have two sparse distributed representation as shown over here, and if we see there is some overlap in these representations, like over here, the more the overlap, the more similar is the meaning of these representations. Like if I say the sparse distributed representation of tea and coffee are much similar compared to tea and biscuit. They are completely different. Now, and its capacity is also very high. Like for 2048-bit vector and 2% are set, that means 2% sparsity. Only 2% of the neurons are active. We have 10 to the power 84 unique patterns. And this capacity was calculated using this formula. Given the number of bits, that is 2048 bits, we have the number of on bits, we have factorial, divided by the number of off bits, factorial. Now, as we see, these two representations with shared bits have some shared semantic informations. Comparing two representation is as simple as taking the intersections of two indices sets. Sparse distributed representations are inherently fault tolerant and noise tolerant representations. If we move along, now we have this sparse distributed representation. We have this neuron from this, we have this HTM neuron. From this HTM neuron, we derive the different grid cells. Taking one grid cells over here and taking one column, if I input some feed forward, if I give some feed forward input to this thing, to this column, then what happens is all the neurons on this column gets fired. That means gets active. Let us take two different cases. The first is the case of no predictions, and the second is the case of predictions. Now let's say at time is equals to 0, my brain does not know anything. My system does not know anything. So it is completely inactive. No neuron is active. But at time is equals to 1, I input some feed forward. I place some feed forward input over here, due to which the neurons in those columns are active. And this forms the sparse distributed representations of that particular feed forward input. If I take another case, which is a predicted input, I already know that, okay, this particular feed forward input is coming along. I should be ready. I should predict something. Then the neurons in those columns, single neurons in those columns, as we see over here, one, this corresponds to this corresponds to this, are in the predictive state. So these neurons are predicting. These neurons being in a predictive state are actually predicting that my next stage as t is equals to 1 will be the active columns. And that actually happens over here. At t is equals to 1, the predictions comes true, so that the neurons in the corresponding columns becomes active. Now, because these neurons in the corresponding columns becomes active, in the next step, at t is equals to 2, it has to predict something. Therefore, it excites the nearby neuron, which is near it. Like, it excites the nearby neurons and changes them into the predictive state, so that at t is equals to 2, another column, another neuron in another column may become active. So this is how the SDR learns sequences and make predictions to what the next input SDR will be. It is extremely robust, and which has a 40% noise tolerant. It is completely an unsupervised learning, and it is a continuous learning in real time. Learns higher order sequences. So let's take an example of and see how it learns higher order sequences like ABCD and XBCY. Let's see. So we have this first case before learning, where I apply some feed forward inputs like A, and this is the sparse distributed representation of A. B, this is the sparse distributed representation of B, C, D. Then again, I train another series of values like X, B, C, Y. Now, once the algorithm learns this series, A, B, C, D, then X, B, C, Y. Once it learns these things, once I input A, what should the algorithm do? The algorithm should predict B, right? So therefore, this firing all the neurons in the A by feed forward input will excite the neurons in the column of B. Now make sure there's only one neuron that gets fired in the column, which is represented by B. Now as we know, like B is represented by the particular column where the neuron is fired. So this is the sparse representation of B. Now once it reaches B, it then predicts C, and this resembles this structure. The column matches over here. And once it reaches C, it reaches D, it predicts D, and so on. Now if instead of A, I input X now, what happens over here is all the neurons get fired. This is my input over here. Now what it should also be predicting B. It is still predicting B, but now the neuron that is fired is in different row, but in the same column. Similarly, it is predicting C. The neurons that is fired is in the different row, but in the same column, which represents the same C. And this C is then predicting Y. More elaborately, if I need to look into it, what is happening is I'm placing the A input over here. Now these neurons are predicting B over here. Like these neurons are taking the configuration of B in the predictive state, as we can see by the red points over here. And the next input is B, which is already predicted. Now, because of this B predicted input, it will then predict the next step C, which has a similar representation over here. Now, say for example, if instead of A or X, I input B. Now, my algorithm does not know which B is this. Is it the B from A or is it the B from X? Let's see what it does over here. So the B input excites the neurons that represents both C and C bar, C prime and C double prime. So both the neurons in these columns are excited over here. Similarly, you get the C input now. The neurons in the C input gets activated. Now this C input will then predict both D prime and Y double prime as shown over here. So this is one of the best and the most important characteristics of HTM, the characteristics of multiple predictions. Say for example, you are tossing a coin. If you are tossing a coin, your predictions is not only head, your predictions is also tail. So if you are detecting some anomaly in tossing a coin, you can either get head or you can either get tail. So you also have that multiple predictions in that case. And if something other than head or tail comes up, that can be regarded as anomaly. Similar is the case of throwing a dice. It has six-sided. So it has six different predictions. Anything away from that, it can be regarded as anomaly. So talking about anomaly, anomalies are the data points within the data sets that appear to deviate markedly from the expected output. Anomaly detection refers to the problem of finding patterns in data that don't conform to expected behavior. So this is the results from the Numenta, where they have predicted the anomaly for some machine temperature sensor data. As we can see, this point is quite out of range, out of this user range, and this point is also quite out of this user range. These are just normal anomalies. However, the interesting thing is over here. Now, as we can see, if we just take the magnitude of this particular data, then this point may not be regarded as the anomaly. However, if we see the temporal sequence of this data, there is something happening as we can see over here, then this can be regarded as the anomaly. In the next case, I'll explain to you what is the flowchart of the anomaly detection used by HTM. So for an HTM, we have the input xt. We convert that into the sparse distributed representation. It goes through the algorithm. It calculates the prediction error, which is also known as anomaly score, which is basically the fractions of active columns which we are not predicting mathematically. That is the definition. And prediction error or anomaly score are not the standard for detecting anomaly. It is actually the anomaly likelihood, which is calculated more by modeling the distributions of error values over the window of timestamp from the past. So if we can take anomaly score as the instantaneous anomaly, anomaly likelihood can be regarded as much more concrete standard for detecting anomaly, which takes the order of the past timestamp as well. So once the input reaches the HTM, the encoder, because of the encoder, it converts the given input into a sparse distributed representation, and then it goes to a spatial pooler and sequence memory, and gradually, accordingly, whatever it predicts, the prediction error or not, and then the anomaly likelihood. And based on the anomaly likelihood, we'll come to know whether the given data or the system has an anomaly or not. We applied this algorithm in this operate first CPU users data. Now, operate first CPU users data can be extracted using the Thanos metrics and Prometheus API client. So details about it are given in this GitHub link over here. So once we extract the data from certain time period, we will then apply our algorithm to see if there is an anomaly that we can find in the CPU users data or not. So let's move on to the demo. So here's the demo notebook, and the code snippets are taken from the Numenta GitHub fork. However, I have formatted this notebook with respect to Jupyter notebook readable format. So let's move on. So here are a couple of classes which we need to install, packages which we need to install, HTM packages. The first set of data is CPU users data, which we have is the entries that we have is 576. The parameters value, the default parameters value, like the sparsity is 2%, time, weekend, and permanence 0.1. All these parameters values are the default parameters value given by the Numenta website. So I'm just using those values. As per the period is concerned, the period is the amount of time the system learns the amount of data before it starts trusting. So if I consider my length of is 576, if I take the period of 40, I'm just taking the considerable length of the period so that I can see some anomaly in the later point of the data. But in principle, the more the period, the better it is, which means the more the sample of the data, the better it is. So if we just run this notebook, let's see how it looks. So we calculate the anomaly score, we calculate the anomaly likelihood, and here we have the plots. So here we have the input signal given by the green points. Here we have the anomaly likelihood signal. Now this anomaly likelihood is definitely higher over here, which depicts there is some anomaly at this point, there is some anomaly at these points. Now if we consider anomaly score as well in the plot, it will see something like this. Let's wait for some time. So yeah, so this blue point is the anomaly score. Now as we can see, if we go with the anomaly score, then most of the points you see are regarded as the anomaly. However, that is not so. Anomaly likelihood is the main detector of the anomaly. So if you go by anomaly likelihood, we do see some anomaly points in the plot. If we consider the real-time analysis of this data, we will see something like this. The input signal in the green goes along, and there is a constant prediction that is done by the algorithm. Based on this input and predictions, it calculates the anomaly score at first, and at first the anomaly score is pretty huge because the system has not learned anything. The anomaly likelihood is pretty flat because the system does not know anything about anomaly. So as it moves along, it detects some anomaly on the process. So this is how the streamline data goes by. If we take another set of data, which is much larger than this, let's see how it looks. If we take another set of data, so here we can see it is 1679 entries, which is also not pretty big, but still like it's good for the demonstration. I've increased the number of periods by 400 so that the system can learn more. So if I go to my plot again, what I'll see is here. So you can also see this table. Here's the time, here's the value for the CPU users. At first, the system has not predicted anything. Then the anomaly score is 1 in the beginning. Anomaly likelihood is very, very small in the beginning. If we plot those data over here, we do see. So this is the CPU uses values all over, and the corresponding anomaly score given by blue points, which shows that there's a huge anomaly in the points, but it is not the actual detector of anomaly. The actual detector of the anomaly is anomaly likelihood given by the red, and we do see some anomaly in the curve. If we do the real-time analysis, we do see the changing of signals. So input signals given in green, it goes away, and the corresponding anomaly score is correspondingly calculated, and the anomaly likelihood is again calculated accordingly. So this is how we do the real-time analysis of the anomaly detection. So going back to the presentation now. So there are a couple of commercial applications of HTM as well. Now there's a team called Grok Stream, which uses anomaly detection for commercial purposes. There's a team called Cortical.io, which uses this technology in NLP, natural language processing, and semantic analysis. There's a team called Intellect.com, which has originated from 2020, and it is used to detect the stock market values. And for a stock market prediction company to hold for more than a year seems like a promising prospect. So these are some applications of HTM in anomaly detection and other industries. So most of the materials in this talk are covered from numenta.com and htm.core for community in GitHub. I would also like to thank Marcel Hilt, who have suggested me to read On Intelligence books, and which helped me to spike some of the neurons in my brain. Thank you very much for this. Thank you very much, all the attendees, for listening to the talk. You can reach out to me at this email, my LinkedIn, my GitHub page, and if you want to follow my individual work, the fork repository is HTM applications in AI COE AI Ops. Thank you very much.
I have a few questions, if I may ask.
Yes, please.
So very enlightening talk and presentation. I enjoyed very much everything that you have presented here. When it comes now to the implementation that you have used, because I tried to make a parallel with traditional time series based anomaly detection. And I'm sorry, but I couldn't understand, like, what is the length of the sliding window you used in this scenario? Because I saw at some point use like something you changed to 400. So basically used the last 400 points in order to be able to predict future values.
Yes. So I'm not sure whether it's called a sliding window, but well, I just changed the period of the anomaly parameter, and the period signifies about the main function of that period is how many data points can I take before the actual detection of the anomaly. So Numenta suggests me to take as much period as possible, probably 1,000, but for that I need to have a lot of data sets. So that's what I did.
I'm sorry, let me try to rephrase that, because I'm not so sure if my message was passed on correctly to you. So in traditional time series predictions, you have a data set of length n, and usually you take a sample of length t, let's say 5 or 10, something like this. Let's use seconds, okay? The last 5 seconds in order to predict the next value, right? and but the data format has to be three-dimensional for any tensor to be able to work with it. If you use TensorFlow, for example, so the third dimension is basically the number of features that you use. If it's a univariate time series, then obviously it's one. Multivariate, like how many of those you have. So in your case, n, like the entire data set that you had, like how long it was, t, the number of the values that you used in order to predict the next value, how long it was. And the last question I have is, starting at some point in time, let's say t0, with that amount of value, let's say last 5 seconds or 10 seconds, or how many you used in order to train your network, how far in the future can you go before you take a new check of the real world, to see like how far off your predictions are? Can you go like just 1 second? Can you go 5 seconds or 10 seconds in the future? This is a point of interest, that I'm actually also doing some research, in time series. So that's why I'm asking all these questions.
Yeah, that's a very good questions actually, because personally, I have not checked it like one by one, how far it should go. At the moment, I'm just looking at whether it can predict something or not. To tell you about the predictions, I have predicted in the first step and the fifth stage. So I'm taking a five time step window at the moment for the predictions. So, but regarding your questions, I may need to work in this a bit so that I can answer that perfectly.
Okay, so I put my questions in the chat. You may have a look at them, and when you have an answer, that you could, suggest back something, then please reach back to me, because I'm really interested in this.
Sure.
I mean, if you can also share the notebook that you presented, then maybe I can find the answer myself over there. So we can maybe collaborate, for something in the future.
Awesome. That would be great. Yeah.
Well, thank you for your time, and thank you once again for the great presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank
you. Thank you, Surya, for this amazing presentation. I think Shay also had a question. Shay, would you want to ask this question yourself?
Yeah, so when you were presenting the slide with sequence prediction, I had posted a question about like
how much
memory would it take to represent one letter. So it seemed like we had a grid of like neurons, and then each neuron would light up, and then we would know that it was an A or something like that. But to do that, we had to represent each letter with a grid, right? So I was wondering, let's say if you have
the idea, the idea over here is like, say for example, as I understand from your questions, to encode the name Apple, as you said, I need to encode A, B, P, L, E, right? That's what APP. You are saying that we need to individually encode each letter, right?
Right, that's right.
Right, but that is not the case. So for each word, each different representation, like A may have different representation in 2048-bit of grid cells.
Okay.
Apple may have different representation. So it's each individualistic, each representation is unique in each case. Yeah.
Okay.
It's like the hash function.
Yeah. That's what I was thinking. So there would be collisions, right? Like overlaps.
But yes, that's also the point, because if I say fruit or apple or banana, right, they fall under the fruit column, right, fruit group. So they should have some overlap, because there is some similarity in terms of food. But
so you're saying in the encoded space they would be together, like in
they will have some overlap. They do not have complete overlap. They should not have complete overlap, but they will have some overlap. Now, if I'm talking about two mutually exclusive events, their overlap is completely zero. There's nothing, which represents the two objects are completely distinct from each other.
And that translates to the CPU usage application that you talked about in a way that we have representation of certain types of spikes close together in the embedded space, whereas some flats close together in the embedded space. Okay. Sounds good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
All right. Do we have any more questions for Surya? Okay, awesome. Thank you again, Surya, for an amazing presentation. And thank you to all of you for attending this meetup. We will send you an updated email with the presentation and the video recording, and hope to see you guys again after 2 weeks. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.